It doesn't make any difference if the churches today have stopped preaching on hell, if the preachers don't preach on hell, if the seminaries and Bible colleges don't teach the young men about hell, if they extricate it from the Bible. It makes no difference whatsoever. It is still a place that you must deal with one day. Somebody, my friend, died this morning and they went to hell.
Welcome to Naked Pentecostalism. I'm your host, Isaac Coverstone. This is episode 22 of Naked Pentecostalism, and I wanted to cover a topic that somehow I thought I covered in the past, but maybe somehow it got missed. So this is going to be all about the creation versus evolution debate, and this is a huge topic. Like, there is so much material that could be covered, that could be broken down. It's going to be almost impossible to really cover all of it in one episode or even a series. So this won't be a very deep dive necessarily. We're going to just try to go over the highlights and the high-level view. But really, I wanted to share kind of my experience with the last 6 years of debating people on the topic and watching other people debate on the topic and kind of glean where I think the current state of the discussion is at. So there's something like, I think the most recent polls I've seen were 2019, maybe 2020, in which I saw it was around a third to maybe 40% of Americans or American adults held some type of creationist view. And this is predominantly because we have such a culture that is focused on evangelical Protestant religion. That number is quite a bit higher in Muslim countries and some Southeast Asian countries that are predominantly Christian or Muslim. So most of this belief in a strict creationist viewpoint tends to be from a position of very heavy indoctrination with religion. Certainly when I was homeschooled, this was the view that I was indoctrinated in from a very young age. And it was a view that I held until probably my early 30s when I really started to try and understand it properly. Because I think, in the end, this is just kind of my viewpoint on it. I'm sure I could be wrong, but essentially, people aren't curious enough to really go and self-teach and discover what's real and what's not. There's a lot of people that will just take what they've been taught at face value, and they are happy to stop right there. And this is, I think, the root of the issue with creationism, and that is we hear the same arguments over and over again, and many of them have been debunked or just, completely obliterated over the past 50 years, 60 years or more, and yet we keep seeing them over and over again. So clearly there's a pattern where there is no interest in improving the argument. There's no interest in creationists coming up with better arguments or changing their mind on it. It's just getting spat back out at the same exact manner, and it's very tiresome. So what the common trend seems to be a lack of understanding of the subject. Now, that may sound like a trope, that may sound like a low effort rebuttal, but really that's what we're running up against, is just people not taking the time to fully comprehend both sides of the discussion. That's just the way I see it, honestly. You could take a single piece of evidence, such as I think the strongest smoking gun for evolution is probably the ERVs, endogenous retrovirus insertions. And really we're talking about a virus infecting a reproductive cell so that the virus is passed down as part of the genetic code of that organism. And this happens in almost every mammal species, maybe every living species, period. Viruses get into everything. So you have this limited event, because the odds of that virus actually creating the infection isn't 100%. So you have the odds of the virus actually infecting, then the odds of the virus infecting an endogenous cell that's going to reproduce and stick with the next generation. And then you have that organism surviving to reproduce so that it actually does pass on the virus. So there's all these different levels of screening before we end up with a brand new generation of species that all share the same virus, and they're passing it down again and again. So what this means is you have an endogenous retrovirus insertion as a marker in the genetic code. It's an event that is notable in terms of this is definitely something that didn't just randomly pop in. It's been there because of a variety of factors came together. So you have species like human beings that have a certain percentage of ERVs in our genetic code, and we can map that and say, okay, in this particular strand, there's 10,000 ERVs, and we share 90% of those ERVs with chimpanzees or bonobos or orangutans. But it's not just the number of ERVs, but it's the specific locations and where they're located in the DNA strand. So think of it as, the best analogy that I've come up with was, and this is not original to me, I found it somewhere, but someone draws a map, they sign it, because back in the day, maps were expensive, and you wanted to get credit for the map that you drew. So the map maker would not just sign it, but they would put a mistake somewhere on the map, which only they know about, and the odds of somebody discovering that mistake and correcting it are almost nil, because it's a very, very small detail somewhere, but it's something that you can look for and know, okay, this map was drawn by this guy, back in the day. And then someone copies the map. If they copy the mistake, then we can still trace that map as being designed back by this other person that originally drew it. And so imagine we have this map and there's 10 different mistakes on it. Well, we know the 9 of these mistakes are not the trademark of the original guy that drew the map. So clearly we have either 9 different people came in at different points, or there was another person that copied the map and just made 9 new trademarked mistakes, and that's unlikely, but there becomes a history of this that we can track. And the same thing applies to like a book. You have a book and it spills a little bit of ketchup on it, and then someone photocopies the book. The photocopy has the spilled ketchup mark. And the more copies of the book go down, we can start to see how, if you read the book and there's no ketchup spill, okay, this is an earlier edition. This is before this ketchup spill happened. And so it's the same concept, right? We're seeing a change in the genetic code, and as we go back through different species, we can see how they have similar mistakes or similar injections of that virus DNA and similar species, or the ones that are in the same family, the same overall structure, will share those same ERV injection points. And this is how we can map and track how different species are related, and not just related, but very clearly descendants of each other, and how they would have some prior ancestor that they have shared, and they are now cousins, or they're a distant family of some type. So this is just one example of that type of evidence that we're dealing with. But at the genetic level, it's very, very clear. Like, there is no doubt that different animal species are related to each other, and we're not created as entirely separate species from the beginning. Like, that's not even being debated in the higher levels of academia and science and whatnot. So this is an example of, people that are not educated on the subject are not aware of this, or if they are aware of it, they don't truly attempt to grasp it and conceptualize it and figure out that it's actually, they absorb the information, basically. And so there is a lack of curiosity, I think. People aren't willing to self-teach and try to discover and try to learn how these different evidences stack up for evolution. And so we see a correlation probably where the people in Western countries, in Europe, and areas where there's a focused education from a secular perspective, they understand these concepts and they have no trouble with it, and they can just and we see a lower acceptance of creationism, but a higher acceptance of evolution. And then you go over to the heavily religious countries where people are just being indoctrinated in the religious texts in a prioritization above secular science and just regular, school teaching. There's a lot more emphasis on myths and folklore and all this kind of stuff. Then there's going to be a higher prevalence of that acceptance of creationism. So it's really, we're banking on that ignorance. That's entirely what's deriving creationism, is just relying on people not being willing to learn and grow and change and understand the evidence. And what's really interesting, maybe it's sort of a smoking gun as well, people that are teaching in favor of creationism generally don't really discuss like the evidence in favor of creationism. They're just making this crazy attempt to try to discredit evolution. And I think the mentality is like, if we discredit evolution, then like by default people have to accept creationism. But like, that's not how that works. It's a really skewed mentality to say, well, if we discredit the case that Joe is the murderer, then by default Dave is the murderer, right? Like, that's never how it works. If you want to present something as true, then you present evidence and logical analysis for that thing being true. Discrediting option B does nothing for the case for option A. It's really kind of a silly mentality to have. But there is just an overwhelming mountain of evidence for evolution in both the fossil record, in the genetic record, in comparative molecular biology, and like there's like 15 different scientific fields that all coalesce and merge and agree on this one subject. Like, our entire understanding of natural science disintegrates if evolution were not true. And it's been verified and backed up by all these different fields over and over and over again, to where now there is no doubt. There is no reason to think that it's not true. So I am more than willing to have a discussion on this topic. Look me up on social media, and I'd be happy to share more information, share more evidence, point you to resources. I'll try to link some resources in the description of the podcast episode, or if you're listening on YouTube, I can post some links in the description of the video. So yeah, this is all about education. This is all about self-discovery and curiosity. So get out there and learn. That's the best advice I can give anyone. But I hope this was helpful, and we'll see you guys on the next episode.
Here's the biggest lie you ever heard in your life. This is the biggest lie you'll ever hear and live by. Well, it'll be like it was yesterday. It'll be like it was last week. Nothing. I've heard the preacher, but nothing's really going to change. That's the reasoning of a fool. You don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what's going to happen. I have no idea. Are you ready?